I give you Razvan Caliman.
Thank you, Bruce. Thank you all for being here today on this session about CSS for decoration. Right, I'm Razvan. Bruce did an awesome introduction of me. I work for Adobe, and for a while I worked with some really amazing people on CSS features. Some of those people actually work in the Adobe Romania office. Some of them may actually be in the audience today. So we worked on CSS shapes, CSS regions, blending, masking, blend modes, some of other features which never actually made it into browsers. And we did web standards and implementation. I don't do that anymore nowadays. Now I do work on tools and prototypes, well, for what's left before I go traveling. I build tools and prototypes for upcoming products in Adobe's lineup. But I'm still very passionate about CSS, and that's the reason I'm here to speak today. So there's this trend of people trying to do things with CSS only, as if other web technologies are not suitable for various use cases. And I have a problem with this because people tend to overuse this desire to do things only in CSS because of performance considerations, like something's better in CSS because it's faster. And the thing which started me down this rabbit hole of things done in CSS was this question on Stack Overflow. So this person's asking if it's possible to create that background image over there with, without using any image whatsoever. Now, without any image, that means not downloading any sort of resource. And yes, there's a couple of ways you can do that. There's SVG. You can do it with polygons in SVG. Or you can do it with a canvas element and draw it with JavaScript if you really want to avoid downloading an image. My solution involved using multiple linear gradients, and my solution didn't get picked. It didn't even get any upvotes. But it's not like I'm going to be upset and write an entire presentation and travel the world trying to convince people otherwise. Am I? So the questions range from the very pertinent one before to something a bit more questionable. So this person, and I have to take note of the tone here, this person wants that lemon shape achieved only with CSS and HTML. And the tone is kind of like this. This is the shape I want. Can it be done with CSS? I have created a circle here. I wouldn't really want working with this person, but there's no harm in asking a question. The problem is that most of the answers this person got were something like this. So people introducing a lot of empty HTML elements to serve as leaves and other things, and then they relied on CSS transforms and various other CSS properties and interactions between things so they can actually get the shape. And I mean, you do get your lemon, you do get what you asked for, but there's a time to actually question these things. And I have a problem with these sort of solutions because CSS was never meant to do illustration at that level. The problem with those solutions are that they're very fragile. They're very dependent on the context and the layout. If something else that changes somewhere in your layout, it's going to break your shape. It's very difficult to maintain because it relies on subtle interactions between CSS properties that were never meant to do that. So yeah, you can do your lemon, you can have your lemon, but you probably won't be able to turn it into an apple 6 months from now. But I'm not totally discounting achieving amazing things using only CSS for illustration. So Lynn Fisher created this amazing collection of illustrations done using a single HTML element and various interactions between CSS properties. And I'm sure she learned a lot of things doing this, and I learned a lot of things reading her code. So definitely a lot of bonus points for that. But do I think these are good solutions for production? No, for the reasons I stated a bit earlier. Well, Lynn has used a lot of CSS features that I term CSS for decoration to achieve those things. And CSS has a lot of them. They're gradients, filters, blend modes, backgrounds, shadows, all sorts of things. But time is short today, so I'm only going to cover CSS gradients and backgrounds today. Oh, and we do have quite a lot to cover. So today we're going to talk about how to create background shapes using CSS gradients, how we can use that knowledge to create skeleton screens to improve perceived performance of applications and interfaces in general. And then we're going to have a look at how we can improve borders in CSS, because they're quite limited, as we'll learn pretty soon. A lot of the things I'm going to talk about today rely on CSS gradients. And many of you in this room today know how CSS gradients work. But for those of you who don't, and for those of us who need a refresher, let's have a quick crash course into CSS gradients. CSS gradients, there are actually two types of CSS gradients implemented in browsers today. So there are linear gradients, and then there's radial gradients. And maybe I should have mentioned this earlier. So when I mentioned about my Twitter account, I just tweeted a link to this entire presentation slide deck. So you can, if you have your laptop with you and it's difficult to see the code over here, you can probably open it on your laptops in Chrome, Opera, or some other modern browser and have a play. So we deal with what we have. We have two different CSS gradients implemented across browsers. One of them is linear gradient, the other one is radial gradient. So over here we have a linear gradient, which is 120 degrees, and then it has a few colors in it. So a linear gradient is essentially a way of displaying colors across a spectrum, a line. In the case of a linear gradient, you have what's called the virtual gradient line, and that's slanted at 120 degrees. So if I change this value up and down, you're probably going to see the gradient change over there. And another thing I should mention is that this entire presentation is built in HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, and the code is interactive. So everything you see on screen today actually works in most modern browsers and most of the things I'm going to show today. So no smoke and mirrors today over here. So we have this gradient angle, which changes the angle of the gradient, and then we have what's called color stops. And I'm using named colors over here, turquoise and Rebecca purple, because it's easier to follow. These color stops essentially mean where on that gradient line will these colors start and stop. So over here we have something from turquoise to purple, and it's going from 0% to 100%. And these are actually the default values. So if I remove 0 and 100%, that gradient up there will not change because the browser just fills those in without me having to define them. I'm going to revert back and then move this first color stop up to about 50%. So that changes how my gradient looks. And then I'm going to reduce the other part of the gradient to like 60%, and then slowly down to almost 50. And as soon as I hit 50%, something interesting happens. At this point, you get a sudden jump in your gradient from one color to the other. You get an edge. And the second value of the color stop here, like 50%, is actually irrelevant because I can go even lower and nothing else is going to happen. The browser actually clamps the value of that color stop to the color stop before it. So you will see a lot of people do something like this. You're going to see people removing the value and replacing it with 0, because unitless 0 is just like unitful 0. And then you'll have people just move the second color stop up and down, so that way you don't have to update the value in two places. And this gives you a bit more flexibility. And obviously, you can still change the angle of that gradient up and down and see what's happening. So that's a quick introduction into linear gradients. Now, radial gradients work pretty much the same way, except instead of displaying colors on a line, it displays them on a virtual gradient ray, something which emanates from a single point in all different directions. So over here, I guess I'm going to start from the end of the declaration. We have color stops again, and color stops behave exactly the same. We can increase something to, say, like 50% over here, and then I can reduce the second one to 50, and I get the hard edge. Or I can reset that one to 0, and I clamp the value to whatever the turquoise value is of there. By default, radial gradients are not circles. By default, they're ellipses. So if I remove this first part of the declaration over here, that's how a radial gradient looks by default. But ellipses are not that fun to look at. I prefer circles, so I'm going to return to a circle, because it's kind of nicer to look at. So with circles, you can actually define how big that circle can be. And say we're going to give it a 300 pixel radius, and there you go. You have a circle which is 600 pixels across. And the eagle eye among you may say, no, that's not right. That's a very small circle. And it's true, because we have turquoise going only up to 50% of that radius. So if we're going to increase the turquoise to almost 90 or 100%, that circle is going to grow in size. Now, something very interesting is going to happen when I increase the value by 1 more to 100%. That turquoise is just going to spill over into infinity and beyond. And this is how gradients actually work. Gradients will fill all the background space available to them when you hit them to 100%. And something special happens with radial gradients. The magic number here is 99%, so you can still clamp that value. Or if you want to be really precise, it's 99.6%. But in this scenario, we actually get a circle which is almost 600 pixels across. 300 is the radius. And we can also do something else with it. We can, for example, move it to some other position. So I can say the at 50% and 50%. So the first value, 50, is the horizontal position, and the second one is the vertical one. And then I can change the vertical one up and down, and I can offset my circle. So you'll notice that my circle, that position over there represents the center of the circle up and down. Okay, so by now, we know how to create some very basic shapes in CSS using only gradients. Simple, but possible. Okay. This is a key bit of information so far. There's 3 keys. And this is going to help you understand the rest of the presentation, is that even though we're using colors over here, CSS gradients for the browser, they're images, not colors. And this is a very important bit of information, because if CSS gradients are treated as images, it means that we can use all of the CSS background properties with CSS gradients. This is really important because we can use background image, background size, clip position, all sorts of properties. I'm only going to cover the ones highlighted in yellow over here today, and we're going to achieve some really cool things even with just these properties. So let's revisit our gradient example from earlier. We have a linear gradient slanted at 120. It goes from 50 to 50, turquoise to purple. And then what can we can do, we can change the background size of this to 50-50. So the first value is the horizontal size, and the second one is the vertical size. So I can actually change the horizontal of this gradient to something smaller or taller or narrower. And you're probably noticing we're getting a lot more gradient than we bargained for. And that's because by default, background repeat in browsers is set to repeat in both directions. And we can cancel that with background repeat, no repeat. I'm going to increase the size of this just a bit so it's easier to see. But now we're just dealing with one surface, one shape in our background available space. And we can also use background position to change where we want to put that. Over here, it's set to center. I can move it to 0% on the horizontal and 0% on the vertical. And then I have a lot more control to position this shape wherever I want to position it. But so far, we're still just using one background image. And the thing is, in CSS, you're not limited to one background image value. You can actually have more than one. So we can define this shape over here in this way. So we can define background image with 2 linear gradients. So the first one goes from turquoise, then to transparent, and the second one goes from transparent, then to purple, but it's positioned in such a way so it appears as if it's a singular shape. But this multiple declaration means that we actually get, if I explode this, we actually get layers in CSS. Layers on the same element. So I didn't need pseudo elements, I didn't need extra empty HTML elements to achieve this. This can be done using multiple gradient declaration on the same background image. And after you do this, it gets more interesting because you're not limited to multiple background image values. Each one of these values can have their own properties. So over here, the first set of values applies to the first gradient, the second set of values applies to the second gradient. So I can change, say, the size of the first one and offset it around, and it changes that independently of the second gradient, which I can move around and play around. And it's still a bunch of layers. They're still stuck together as if they're the same shape. Obviously, you can use multiple background position properties. They're both at the center. I can move one to, say, the top, and the other one, let's move this one to the bottom. And it gets interesting and crazy, the sort of things you can kind of achieve using only CSS gradients. And obviously, we have the background repeat set to no repeat because I want more control over my layers. I don't want them to repeat indefinitely. Okay, so this is the other key bit of information, is that an element can have multiple background images, and each one of these can have their own properties. This is immensely powerful. It's powerful because, again, we can do layers and we can mix and match multiple sorts of gradients. Here I have 2 linear gradients and that circular yellow gradient in the middle, and I can stack them. I can rearrange the position of all these things even programmatically. You can even animate these if you want. I mean, you can obviously see they're animated. So this is really powerful. What can you do with this? Well, I guess it's good to mention this up front, that once you stumble upon a cool solution that you fell in love with, you try to use it everywhere. And I'm definitely guilty of this. So this is not a solution you can use everywhere. And here's an example I tried to recreate. So I went on to Behance to try to find some inspiration. And I found this cool project with interesting multiple backgrounds over there. And I said, I can do this with what I just learned. And the truth is, you can do each one of those background components individually, but the background clip property is not that powerful enough today to actually allow you to clip those values to, say, a circle or a rectangle, which you can then reposition. So achieving this level of craziness is not really feasible with CSS layers, and this is probably a better solution to use SVG anyways. It's not a good solution to try and hack this with multiple empty HTML elements, because you're just shooting yourself in the foot if you want to do that. But this doesn't mean that the solution is actually without merits or value. So this is the website Fast Company, and this is their article page. And you can notice that they have this nice yellow slanted background over there, which they're achieving using an SVG image, which is just fine. But we can do the same thing with using the technique we just learned. So we have this background image created of two gradients over here. One of them is the yellow slanted at 185 degrees, and it goes from a yellow to transparent 0. And then the second value over there is essentially just a solid white background. And that's put there just so I can show you what's going on over here, that you have two different layers. If you need a solid background, you could have just used the background color property for a solid background. So not too much value over there. But this gives us a lot more flexibility, because we can change one value and alter the page, or you can even randomize this if you want more entropy for various effects on the page. Obviously, you can move this up and down and change how that slant looks like depending on your context. Still on Fast Company, you have this article listing page, and there's a lot of things going on over here. And I'm not sure if it's really visible on the projector, but there's a subtle gray slanted shape behind everything. And just so you can see it, I'm going to change it to gray in my demo. So it's very, very visible. What I wanted to show you is that you can achieve the same thing using multiple linear gradients. Again, something slanted at 185. This time, we're reserving 20% to be transparent, clamping the first gray to that 20%, then moving that clamped gray up to 80%, so we maintain between 20 and 80 the gray, and then leaving it off to be transparent again from whatever comes after the 80%. And then obviously we have the linear gradient at the bottom to get basically the demo. That's just gratuitous at this point. But because we're doing this in CSS, it means we have a lot more control over properties. So I can change the background position of that first shape over there. I can move it up and down, and all sorts of effects that you would want to achieve. And I'm not saying you should do this. This is totally achievable with SVG. But maybe you're not comfortable with SVG. Maybe the context is such that you can't use SVG. This is one way of doing it. So that's why I want to stress that I'm not showing you this is the way, and I'm not encouraging you to build solutions which are difficult to maintain over time. Just look at your use cases and see if this thing makes sense or not. Okay, another thing. The original question. I'm sorry, I just don't let go easily. By now, it's probably no surprise how you can achieve that with multiple linear gradients. Over here, we just have a stack of linear gradients. Each one of them is slanted at some position, and they're all a shade of gray somehow. And actually, they're just a stack of elements, a stack of layers. It's just one element, which use some intricate positioning, and you can change these up and down and alter your effect, and then you can save a few bytes without having to download an image, if that's what you choose to do. Other use cases. Patterns. Patterns are an amazing use case for CSS gradients, because you can easily define them and they extend in all directions. This is an example I took from Leah Veru, and it's a polka dot pattern done with radial gradients and a linear one at the bottom. I'm just going to change something to say black, so it's more visible what's going on. So we have those dots repeating at specific intervals, and you can get the polka dot effect and just play around. There's probably one place I should note that I'm using 15% to the white and then starting transparent at 16%. This is not necessary anymore, but it used to be such that browsers had very poor rendering, and the resolution is not helping me here. But if you have a normal resolution laptop, The edges of the circles are actually very smooth in modern browsers. Rendering has improved a lot. But people used to do that trick between 15% and 60% to obtain a bit of feather, a bit of blurriness, so it would smooth out the hard edges from the circles. You don't need to do this anymore, and I'm sorry it doesn't translate that well on a lower resolution, but you get the idea. Liavru made a curation of a collection of CSS patterns a while ago, and these are using all sorts of creative ideas from CSS gradients to achieve patterns of all sorts, like arrows and tiles and all sorts of things. And more recently, Bennett Feely created his own collection of CSS patterns using gradients, but with an added twist. He curates examples which use also blend modes. And with blend modes, you can actually blend colors together in very interesting ways. And if blend modes are unfamiliar to you, you're in luck, because Yuna has a presentation later today where she's going to explain blend modes in details, and I'm sure you're going to have a lot of fun understanding them. Okay, those were patterns and shapes and things. Let's talk about skeleton screens. And I'm not talking about these skeletons, I am talking about the thing to replace this. Progress indicators, specifically loading spinners. We see them often, and we see them for extended periods of time. But progress indicators have a problem, is that they put too much emphasis on the indicator and not enough emphasis on the progress. So this emerging trend called skeleton screens is starting to replace instances where you use progress indicator. Now, a skeleton screen is a spectrum. It's usually an abstracted interface that you can show to the user. And these are some examples of skeleton screens. I'm really sorry about the contrast, but you've probably seen it on the Facebook mobile application, where it shows you a bunch of gray boxes to basically simulate that, hey, we got some content for you, but we're not ready to show it to you yet, but it's going to appear here. And it's a sleight of hand, it's a trick, it's tricking users, and this is why people are on both sides of the opinion poll here. Some people like this, some people think this is deceiving users because you're not actually showing them the real content, you're tricking them, and it's true, but it's no worse than showing them a loading spinner for an extended period of time. But skeleton screens have the added benefit that they create the perception for the user that some content has arrived, or they create their idea that this is where content is going to appear on screen. You're tricking them by a few hundred milliseconds to think about something else, so they don't think that they're waiting. Because there's nothing worse than getting users to your website and then showing them a clock. And that's basically a loading spinner. Okay, so how can we do loading skeleton screens using what we learned today? No big surprise by now, I hope. Reasonable contrast over there. We have over here a background image with multiple CSS gradient declarations over here. So we have a radial gradient that's 50 pixels in radius up there, and it's positioned at 50-50. So I can increase or decrease the value of the circle, and it's light gray. I'm using the trick with 99%, so I can clamp that gray over there, because otherwise it will just go and spill over its entire surface, and you don't want that. And then we have a bunch of linear gradients, which are 20 pixels high and transparent, and then we're going to repeat everything on the y-axis. Now, nothing's repeating right now, but I'm going to get to that back in a second. So we're using multiple background size declarations again. So this one's for the circle, the other ones are for the lines. So the first value is the horizontal again, so I can change the length of each one of those lines and alter the way my skeleton screen for one entry actually looks. We have a clamp on the horizontal, so you can see that it's not going over that. And that clamp is actually coming from the background size, the container size for that thing. And then we obviously have the background position, where we're putting the certain circle at 0, 0, but then we're offsetting each one of these lines by 120, so they don't overlap with the circle over there. And this is all declared on one class name. And the thing is, if you need more instances of this, this is where background repeat y comes into play. Because we have everything tall, 200 pixels tall, which means if I extend the size of my container, I get more or less instances of that skeleton screen. If you don't want to, you don't have to create separate instances for each one of those entries. If you want to trick your users even more that that's actually content coming to load, you can do that. But ideally, you should be working on your performance so people don't end up staring at this for too long that they catch on. Anyway, And there's something really cool about doing this, because remember, we're doing this only in CSS, only one element, no pseudo elements, no DOM elements, and we actually can do this without, we can actually toggle this off without JavaScript too. So over here, we're using this on one class name, and we can use the empty pseudo class selector. So what the empty pseudo class selector means is that those styles are going to apply to the element for as long as there's no content in the element. So you're reaching to the server to get some content down, and as soon as the content is injected into the page, those are the styles are going to be invalidated so they don't show up. So I have a toggle over here. As soon as I toggle the content on or off, the background automatically disappears because of the empty pseudo class selector over here. Because if I remove this, then you obviously are going to see the style. And the thing here is that you don't have to use JavaScript to toggle a class name anymore. You're already doing a lot of things trying to load content onto the page, and this is perhaps one actual performance boost, even though it's absolutely minimal and marginal, because there's one less JavaScript operation that you need to do in your code. You can just rely on CSS to basically run its own behavior. All right. So if you use Facebook on a mobile application, you've probably seen that their skeleton screen has this extra shimmering effect to drive across the point that, hey, we're actually working here. You're not waiting, we're working. And the shimmering effect, this is an example which is almost identical to the previous one. The only extra element here is a new linear gradient put on top over here, and it has a 100-degree slant. And then we're going from semi-transparent white to more opaque white. So if I change one of those values, you see what's going on. It's, again, a trick for the user. We're just sliding across one gradient. And this is because CSS background properties are all animatable. So I'm going to turn that back to white and keep the effect. What's going on over here is that we have the animation shine keyframes over here, and we're offsetting that linear gradient to 100% on the horizontal axis. So if I change this to 50, it just goes, the effect is lost. You really want it to 100%. And again, this is done entirely on one CSS class name, no empty HTML elements, not even SVG. I mean, it would be a DOM structure you'd have to inject and remove from the page. Some people do it with SVG. That it doesn't mean it's wrong. This is another way of doing it and isolating everything in one class name. And obviously, the same thing as before still applies regardless of the animation. So I can use the empty pseudo class selector, and I can toggle content on or off, and that toggles everything off from my page. Like the skeleton screen disappears naturally. I didn't have to do anything else. All done in CSS. Sorry. Right. That was quite a bit of content to cover, and I needed some water. Let's switch over to borders in CSS. So borders in CSS are actually quite limited. You can't have borders which are gradients, you can't have borders which are spanning just partway through the element, and you certainly cannot animate borders in CSS without messing up your entire layout because of reflows and repositionings of stuff. So if borders in CSS are so limited, how did I achieve that? Well, I'm going to teach you. This is a gradient border, and even if you don't see it right now, you will very soon. We have a gradient over here. So first, let me tell you about border boxes. There's a few virtual boxes in CSS. One of them is the content box. So it's the virtual box which surrounds text, basically, the content. The other box is padding box. The padding box goes around the content box, and it's basically the surface you get when you put padding on an element. And then you have what's called the border box. The border box is essentially the box which surrounds the padding box, and it holds the border for you. And by default, all backgrounds in CSS extend all the way to the padding box. So they cover the padding box, but they don't cover the border box. That's why you get borders on your elements and your background doesn't spill into them. But there's a way of changing that. So over here, you see that I have two gradients. One is white at the top and one is some colors at the bottom. And we have a background origin property, and it's set to border box for the second gradient. And that means my second gradient extends over, actually under, the border. And if I change the border from black to transparent, you can actually see that there's a background underneath over there. And what's going on over here? It's a slight trick. It's actually not a hack because this is still a border. If I increase the surface of the border, it's still there. But what it does, this increases the surface for the background underneath to spill over. And just to show you the trick as a bad magician that I am, we have a layer at the top with a solid white color, and then underneath it we have a background with the gradient. Only that the first gradient, the white one, the solid white one, extends to the padding box like normal backgrounds would, but the second one extends underneath the border box. So that's how you can get this border, this gradient border over here without resorting to some other technique. And remember, these are all background properties, which means we can change the background size for that gradient at the bottom. We can actually change the horizontal size or the vertical size of it. And that's how you get borders which extend only partway through your element. It's still a trick because you still have that transparent, that matte white at the top. But in many scenarios, this is going to be good enough. Obviously, it fails when you need to have that thing transparent or you have some crazy gradient interaction, so you need to see through it. That's not going to be a good solution. Probably SVG is your friend over there. But you can resort to CSS if having this solid at the top is helpful. And again, we can change the background position of that border, so you can offset it left or right, or move it up and down. And you're essentially not limited to one gradient. I'm just using one over here so you understand how things interact, but you can use as many gradients as you want, which extend partway here, partway here. There's a lot of decoration you can do, and I stress that this is decoration, this is not design. Design is when you create something to have meaning and understanding, and decoration is when you make it look nice, and it adds a bit of meaning to the design, but it's not essential. So you can do a lot of decoration just relying on these background properties for more than they were. I mean, they were intended to do this, but people don't actually explore this idea. Now, you can also use images for that. You're not supposed to use gradients, and over here we have the exact same technique. We can increase the transparent border underneath there, so it increases the surface of our image, and then we have an image which is set to extend with a background origin to border box. It extends underneath that transparent border, and it's set to cover, so you get more image to always cover your surface. Obviously, you can do 0%, 100% on size, and I can change the size of my image, but obviously that's going to distort my image. It really depends on what you want to achieve, but it's possible. And obviously, it's exactly the same technique. I'm putting something solid at the top to obscure the fact that there's an actual background, extra background underneath over there. How are we doing on time? 5 minutes more? Perfect. Bonus round. I really wanted to show this. So let's see where we can do something practical with these things. Range inputs in HTML, or like the range input. You can actually style the background of a range input to give more meaning to the user. And over here, I'm leveraging the WebKit appearance none property to basically disable the default browser styles of the range input, or slider, whichever way you want to call it. And once I disable that, I can use background images. And over here, I have a linear gradient, which is slanted at 90 degrees, so it goes vertical. It's using black for 2 pixels, and then it goes to transparent, and it's using red for 2 pixels and going to transparent. It's going to repeat horizontally, and then I'm going to use the background size to actually offset how many instances of that gradient I actually get there. So doing your math just right, you will get the rounded values on your slider input. You can add a bit more meaning to the user so they know how far across they've dragged the slider. And obviously you have control over the one at the bottom, and doing your math just right, it means you can overlap the red ones underneath the black ones, so you get the effect over there. Kind of cool to know. Took me a while. And obviously you have the background position, and you can go really crazy with this, move the notches up or down, and get something different for your users. Over there, what's gray in the middle, that's the slider track, and I didn't actually do any work on that. But the cool thing about this is that it doesn't use JavaScript. It just uses CSS and the underlying HTML elements. And this is really powerful because you don't have to throw JavaScript to solve things like accessibility, things like keyboard navigation. All of these things work by default, but you're giving your users a nicer looking slider, and hopefully something which also has a bit of more meaning, not just looks fancy. And this is an example I borrowed from Anna Tudor. She's amazing on CodePen. If you don't know her, search for her on CodePen. She goes by the handle the Baby Dino, and she does some amazing explorations. And this one over here is the wizard input, where you can use the same technique. We have an input type range, which has a step of 1 a minimum of 0 and a maximum of 2. So that gives us 3 values. So essentially what we've built here is a wizard type input. And we're styling it using the techniques we just learned, where we have radial gradient circles set at those offsets over there. It's using a bit more precise positioning over here than I'm comfortable with, so I'm not going to touch a lot of them. But essentially what's going on over here, we have 3 blue and white dots. So I can change this to green so you understand where those dots come from. And then you have the line underneath them, so that's your track. You can also change the number of blue dots over there with the background size. If I change it to 1, you get more instances of circles on your decoration. And I stress this is the decoration because when I move with my cursor or if I click, it still has 3 values. But if you couple the amount of values you have in your input with the precise measurements in your CSS, you can get a wizard input which works with keyboard navigation, and you get this kind of nice looking style without having to resort to a lot of images. And if you need to tweak something, if you need to add an extra image, you're not going to go to rasterize other images or mess about with SVG if you don't want to. All right, so Anna wrote actually a lot of content about repeating linear gradients. They're similar to radial gradients, and there's also repeating linear gradients. They're similar to linear gradients. And they're essentially a way of encapsulating background repeat in the declaration itself. It's a bit more arcane, but she does a very good job of explaining how these work. And she learned how these work because she's built an amazing collection of sliders decorated with the techniques I just showed you, actually borrowed from her. These are all on CodePen. Search for Anna Tudor on CodePen. You're going to find a lot of examples that she built up where you can style these sliders using only CSS. Without resorting to empty HTML elements or to JavaScript. Good. If there's one thing I want you to take away from this today is that CSS is very, very powerful. You can use it to solve some very complex problems if you put your mind to it, and not all problems should or can be solved with CSS. But there are definitely solutions that CSS is a perfect candidate because of the encapsulation and because of the reusability of the solutions. Now, Leah Vrew has written a book called CSS Secrets. This is not a book for beginners, but it covers a lot of the techniques you can use to achieve something like I showed today. And actually, some of the examples I showed you are inspired directly by Leah and her book. So definitely, if you want a challenge, if you want your CSS ego to be brought down a few notches, read Leah's book, and you will learn a lot from it. And if there's one thing I learned from CSS for decoration is that CSS is really powerful, and the things I showed you are okay to be built, but it takes a lot of effort. You need to invent a system for yourself to put property values on multiple lines so you know which one corresponds to which one. And it's okay for simple illustrations or simple decorations. It gets more and more complex the more you want to build into it. And I think this is an awesome opportunity for tooling and browser developer tools. So we have developer tools for developers. I would want to see some sort of GUI or some sort of controls which allow designers to create these kind of things just by dragging and dropping things like you would in a program like Photoshop or Sketch or something like that, because this gives you a lot more power to actually create cool things in CSS. Well, that's the end of my presentation, and I'm very thankful for HTML because I can fix that on stage. That's my Twitter handle again. If you want to tweet me any questions that I can't answer today, all of the slides are at that URL, and I'm going to tweet out a link to the source code if you want to have a look at that as well. Thank you so much for your attention.
Razvan Caliman, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you. Thanks.